Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to never fully feel finished? Not physically finished, internally finished, like your body stops at night, but your mind never does. There's always one more thing to think about, one more responsibility, one more pressure, one more conversation replaying inside your head. And even when nobody around you sees it, your soul quietly keeps running long after the day ends. Some people are tired not because they hate life, but because they've spent years trying to hold life together without ever slowing down internally. And perhaps that is exactly why the story of Martha feels so personal to so many people today. Because Martha loved Jesus deeply. She wasn't cold. She wasn't rebellious. She wasn't faithless. In fact, she may have been one of the most devoted people in the room. Yet somehow, even in the physical presence of Jesus, her soul remained restless. That matters deeply, because many people secretly believe that loving God automatically removes inner exhaustion. But Scripture paints a much more human picture. Luke chapter 10 tells us that Jesus entered a village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home, and immediately, Martha began serving, preparing, working, managing, organizing, making sure everything was right. Meanwhile, her sister Mary sat quietly at Jesus' feet, listening to him. And eventually, Martha reaches a breaking point emotionally, not because she hated serving, but because her soul had become overwhelmed. And maybe that's what exhausted people understand immediately when they read this story, because the problem was never the work itself. The problem was the internal pressure underneath it, the invisible feeling that everything depended on her, the quiet fear that if she stopped moving, something would fall apart. And perhaps many people listening tonight know exactly what that feels like, because some souls do not know how to rest anymore, not because they are lazy, but because their nervous system quietly learned that slowing down feels unsafe. And maybe that sounds deeper than a simple Bible story. But perhaps Martha's exhaustion was never only physical. Perhaps it was emotional, mental, spiritual. Because overloaded souls often attach their worth to usefulness. If they are helping, they feel valuable. If they are producing, they feel safe. If they are needed, they feel important. But the moment life becomes still, anxiety suddenly rises to the surface. And perhaps that is why Martha struggled so deeply while Mary sat peacefully, because silence exposes what busyness often hides. And maybe your life has become so full of movement because stillness feels unfamiliar now. Not sinful, just unfamiliar. There are people who genuinely love God, yet internally feel like they can never fully rest, even during prayer, even during worship, even during quiet moments, because the mind continues racing long after the body stops moving. And perhaps Martha's story is not about choosing laziness over responsibility. Perhaps it's about discovering the difference between devotion and emotional overfunctioning. Because people can serve constantly, while their soul quietly starves for presence. And maybe that sentence describes more people than we realize, especially today. Modern life rewards constant movement, constant productivity, constant availability, constant noise. But the soul was never designed to live emotionally overstimulated forever. And perhaps one reason people feel so internally exhausted now is because they have forgotten how to simply be present with God without trying to earn peace through performance. But Jesus never asked people to perform for rest. He invited them into it. That changes the entire story, because when Martha finally speaks to Jesus, notice what she says. "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself?" That sentence reveals something painful happening inside her heart. Martha no longer feels seen, no longer feels supported, no longer feels emotionally held. And exhausted people often reach that exact emotional place quietly, not angry at God necessarily, just overwhelmed, emotionally stretched thin, internally carrying too much for too long. And perhaps tonight your soul understands Martha more than you expected, because maybe you know what it feels like to love deeply while quietly feeling overwhelmed at the same time, to care deeply while internally exhausted, to keep functioning while your inner world begs for rest. And perhaps what makes this story so powerful is that Jesus does not shame Martha. He doesn't humiliate her. He doesn't mock her exhaustion. Instead, he speaks gently. Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things. Notice his tone, gentle, personal, compassionate. Jesus saw beyond the activity. He saw the anxiety underneath it. And perhaps that matters more than many people realize. Because God does not only see behavior, he sees burden, he sees pressure, he sees the hidden emotional exhaustion underneath constant movement. And perhaps tonight, he sees yours too, not with disappointment, but with compassion. Because maybe your soul was never created to carry this much internal pressure constantly. Maybe you were never meant to live emotionally rushed every moment of your life. Maybe peace was never supposed to be earned through exhaustion. And maybe the reason your soul feels tired lately is not because you don't love God enough. Maybe it's because your heart has been moving faster than your spirit was created to live. And perhaps tonight, God is not asking you to become less responsible. Perhaps He is simply inviting your exhausted soul to sit down for a moment, to breathe again, to stop measuring your worth by constant movement, to stop believing your value disappears when productivity slows down. Because Mary discovered something Martha had forgotten temporarily. The presence of Jesus was not another task to manage. It was a place to rest. And perhaps tonight, your soul needs that reminder too. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from doing bad things. It comes from doing too many good things without ever allowing the soul to breathe, and perhaps that is one of the saddest forms of spiritual exhaustion, because people can look responsible externally, while internally they are quietly collapsing. They keep showing up, keep helping, keep smiling, keep carrying, but deep inside, peace slowly disappears, and maybe that is exactly where Martha found herself, not in rebellion against God, but in overextension, trying to hold together more than her soul could emotionally sustain, because serving becomes dangerous when it slowly replaces presence. That sounds strange at first, especially in Christian environments where productivity is often praised constantly. But notice something deeply important in Luke chapter 10. Jesus never tells Martha that serving is wrong. He never criticizes hospitality. He never mocks responsibility. The issue was never her actions. The issue was what those actions were doing to her soul. Because somewhere between the cooking, the preparing, the organizing, the expectations, and the pressure, Martha stopped experiencing peace in the very presence of Jesus. And maybe that sentence describes more modern believers than we realize. There are people who genuinely love God, yet live emotionally overwhelmed almost every day. Not because they reject Him, but because their inner life never slows down enough to receive what He is offering. And perhaps that is one reason this story feels so painfully modern, because many people today do not know how to exist without constant internal urgency. Even resting feels unproductive. Even silence feels uncomfortable. Even slowing down creates guilt. And eventually the soul becomes trapped in a cycle where worth is measured by movement. The more exhausted someone becomes, the more they feel they must keep proving themselves. And perhaps Martha's frustration with Mary reveals something deeper than irritation. Perhaps it reveals grief. Because emotionally exhausted people often begin resenting the peace they cannot access themselves. Mary was sitting peacefully, listening peacefully, resting peacefully, and Martha could see it, but instead of joining her, she became more emotionally overwhelmed watching it happen. That matters deeply, because sometimes people do not attack peace because they hate it. Sometimes they attack peace because they secretly miss it. And perhaps there are souls listening tonight who miss peace more than they realize. Not temporary distraction, not entertainment, not escape. Real peace, the kind where the nervous system softens, the mind quiets, the breathing slows, the soul no longer feels emotionally chased by life constantly. And maybe Martha had not felt that kind of peace in a very long time. Because overloaded souls often become physically present while emotionally absent. The body is there, but internally, the mind remains trapped in pressure, thinking ahead, managing outcomes, preventing problems, preparing constantly, and eventually, the soul loses its ability to simply receive a moment fully. That happens quietly, slowly, without people noticing at first, until one day they realize they no longer know how to sit still without anxiety immediately appearing. And perhaps that is why Jesus responds so tenderly. Martha, Martha. When names are repeated in scripture like that, it often reveals deep compassion. Jesus was not annoyed. He was reaching for her heart gently. And perhaps tonight, he is doing the same for someone listening now. Because exhausted souls often expect correction from God, when what he actually offers is compassion. Many people secretly believe God is disappointed in them for being tired, disappointed in their anxiety, disappointed in their emotional overwhelm. But the story of Martha reveals something profoundly different. Jesus recognizes her burden before addressing her behavior. You are worried and upset about many things. Many things, not one thing, many things. That phrase alone explains why so many souls feel exhausted now. Because modern life overwhelms people with endless mental tabs constantly open inside the brain. Responsibilities, relationships, future fears, financial stress, emotional tension, unanswered questions, invisible grief, and the human nervous system was never designed to carry nonstop internal stimulation forever. Yet many people live exactly that way every day. And eventually, the soul stops feeling rested even after sleep. Because sleep cannot fully heal what internal pressure keeps reopening emotionally. And maybe tonight your exhaustion is not simply physical. Maybe your soul has been overloaded for longer than you realized. Perhaps you became so accustomed to inner tension that peace itself now feels unfamiliar. And maybe that's why the story of Martha matters so much. Because Jesus never tells her to become less loving. He invites her into something deeper than constant activity. Presence, stillness, attention, connection, rest. And perhaps one reason Mary could sit peacefully at Jesus' feet is because she understood something Martha temporarily forgot. Jesus had not entered the house to inspect performance. He came to be with them. That changes everything. Because many exhausted people secretly live as though God is constantly evaluating them, measuring them, waiting for them to do more, be better, fix themselves faster. But Jesus does not walk into Martha's house demanding performance. He walks into her home offering presence. And perhaps tonight your soul needs that reminder too. God is not asking you to earn rest before receiving it. He is inviting you into rest first, before the fixing, before the answers, before the future becomes clear. And perhaps peace begins exactly there. The moment your soul realizes you do not need to constantly prove your worth in the presence of God. You are already loved there. already seen there, already welcomed there, even tired, even overwhelmed, even emotionally exhausted. And perhaps that is why Jesus gently says, only one thing is needed, not 50 things, not endless striving, not nonstop pressure. One thing. Because maybe the soul heals differently than the world teaches. Maybe healing begins not when life becomes perfectly controlled, but when the heart finally slows down enough to sit near God without trying to manage everything at the same time. And perhaps tonight, your exhausted soul is being invited into that kind of peace for the very first time in a long while. One of the most revealing parts of Martha's story is the word Jesus chooses to describe her condition. He does not simply say she was busy. He says she was worried and troubled about many things. And in another translation, Scripture says Martha was distracted. Distracted. That word matters more than most people realize, because distraction is not always loud. Sometimes distraction looks responsible, productive, efficient, helpful, but internally, it slowly pulls the soul away from peace. And perhaps that is one of the quietest dangers of modern life. Not evil, not rebellion, not hatred toward God, just endless distraction, a mind constantly divided, a heart constantly pulled in different directions, and eventually, the soul becomes too emotionally scattered to rest deeply anymore. That is what happened to Martha, not because she stopped loving Jesus, but because too many internal pressures were competing for her attention at the same time. And maybe many people listening tonight understand that feeling intimately. The feeling of trying to pray while your thoughts keep running, trying to rest while your nervous system stays alert, trying to be present while your mind keeps racing ahead. And perhaps one reason modern souls feel so exhausted is because attention itself has become fragmented. People rarely live fully inside one moment anymore. Even during quiet moments, the mind remains crowded, thinking, predicting, analyzing, scrolling, comparing, preparing, reacting, and eventually, the soul loses its ability to feel stillness deeply. Not because God disappeared, but because distraction became constant. And perhaps Martha's story reveals something uncomfortable but true. A person can physically be near Jesus while mentally far away. That is painful to admit, but deeply human, because overloaded minds struggle to remain emotionally present. And maybe your soul has experienced that lately. You sit down to pray, but your thoughts immediately run toward unfinished responsibilities. You open the Bible, but your mind keeps replaying conversations. You try to rest, but internally you still feel emotionally on. And perhaps you secretly wonder, why can't I slow down? But maybe the better question is, what has my soul been carrying for so long that stillness now feels difficult? Because distraction is often a symptom of deeper emotional overload. The human nervous system can only process so much internal pressure before attention begins fracturing, and modern life constantly floods the mind with stimulation, notifications, noise, information, pressure, opinions, urgency, comparison, fear. The soul was never designed to absorb this much non-stop input without consequences. And perhaps one reason people feel spiritually numb now is because their inner world never becomes quiet long enough to notice God's presence gently. Not because God stopped speaking, but because constant distraction slowly trains the mind to live everywhere except the present moment. And perhaps that is why Mary's posture matters so much in this story. She sits, listens, receives. Nothing about her posture is rushed. Nothing about her presence is fragmented. And perhaps Jesus was not only defending Mary, perhaps he was inviting Martha into the same kind of inner stillness, because deep peace cannot survive inside a constantly divided soul. And maybe your exhaustion has less to do with how much you are doing, and more to do with how emotionally scattered your inner world has become. There are people who physically rest, yet never mentally arrive in rest internally. Their body sits still, but their mind keeps sprinting endlessly. And eventually the soul becomes chronically overstimulated, not dramatic, just tired, quietly tired. The kind of tiredness where even small decisions feel heavy sometimes. And perhaps Martha had lived in that emotional state longer than she realized. Because distracted souls often believe peace will finally come later, after the work is finished, after the pressure decreases, after the future becomes stable, after the responsibilities slow down. But life rarely becomes completely quiet externally. And perhaps Jesus wanted Martha to understand something deeper. Peace is not found after everything calms down externally. Peace begins internally first. That changes everything. Because many people are waiting for a future version of life to finally allow themselves to rest emotionally. But the soul can spend years chasing peace that way without ever reaching it. And maybe tonight your exhausted heart needs permission to stop postponing peace. Not irresponsibility, not avoidance. Peace. The kind that exists even before everything is solved. Because Jesus never told Martha, "Come back after the house is perfectly managed." He invited her into presence in the middle of unfinished things. That matters deeply. Because many exhausted people secretly believe they must earn rest by finally completing everything. But human life never fully empties itself of responsibilities. There will always be another task, another pressure, another expectation, another unfinished detail. And perhaps one reason the soul becomes chronically exhausted is because it keeps attaching peace to a future moment that never fully arrives. Meanwhile, Mary sits peacefully beside Jesus in the middle of unfinished life. That image alone feels healing, because maybe God never expected people to become emotionally perfect before resting in His presence. Maybe He knew human beings would always be unfinished, always healing, always learning, always carrying something. And perhaps peace begins the moment the soul finally stops saying, "I'll rest when everything is done." Because maybe that day never fully comes. Maybe rest was meant to exist in the middle of ordinary life all along. In the middle of unanswered questions. In the middle of imperfect days. In the middle of emotional overload. In the middle of uncertainty. And perhaps tonight, Jesus is gently inviting your distracted soul back into that kind of stillness again. Not through pressure, not through guilt, but through presence. The kind that slowly quiets the mind, softens the nervous system, and reminds the soul, you do not have to mentally carry everything at once. You are allowed to sit here too. One of the quiet lies exhausted people often believe is this: I'll rest later. Later when life slows down. Later when the responsibilities become smaller. Later when the bills are paid. Later when the house is peaceful. Later when the anxiety disappears. Later when the future feels safer. And without realizing it, many souls spend years postponing peace. Not because they hate rest, but because they believe rest must be earned first. And perhaps Martha believed that too. Perhaps somewhere deep inside her heart she thought, if I can just finish everything, then I'll finally sit down. But the painful reality is that life rarely stops creating new things to carry. New pressures appear, new needs appear, new worries appear. And eventually, the soul becomes trapped inside a cycle where rest always belongs to a future version of life that never fully arrives. That is one reason so many people feel chronically tired now. Not because they never stop physically, but because emotionally, they never allow themselves to arrive anywhere internally. The mind stays in constant anticipation, constant management, constant preparation. And perhaps your soul knows exactly what that feels like. You finish one responsibility, and immediately your mind jumps toward the next one. You solve one problem, and immediately anxiety searches for another. You complete one task, yet internally you still do not feel calm, because exhausted souls often do not know how to stop emotionally even when the external work pauses. And maybe that is why Martha's story feels so deeply personal, because many people are not only busy externally, they are internally unable to release responsibility emotionally. And eventually, life begins feeling heavy all the time. Not because every moment is terrible, but because the soul never fully unclenches. It never fully breathes. It never fully feels safe enough to rest. And perhaps that is one reason Jesus responds so gently to Martha, because he recognizes that her exhaustion is not simply about dishes or serving. It is about an anxious soul trying to hold together too many things at once. And maybe modern believers are doing the same thing constantly now, trying to emotionally manage life without ever slowing down enough to simply receive God's presence peacefully. That happens quietly, especially with responsible people, capable people, helpful people, people everyone depends on. Because the more dependable someone becomes, the harder it often becomes for them to believe they are allowed to stop. And eventually, the soul begins confusing rest with irresponsibility. But Scripture never presents rest as weakness. In fact, God Himself established rhythms of rest from the very beginning. Genesis says God rested on the seventh day, not because He was tired, but because rest was always meant to be part of healthy human existence. That matters deeply, because modern culture often treats nonstop productivity as virtue. But heaven does not glorify emotional exhaustion. And perhaps one reason so many people feel disconnected internally now is because they have lived too long without true soul rest. Not entertainment, not distraction, not temporary escape. Rest, sacred rest. The kind where the soul no longer feels emotionally hunted by life. And maybe Martha had forgotten that kind of rest entirely, because overloaded people often become addicted to internal urgency without realizing it. Stillness starts feeling unnatural. Silence starts feeling uncomfortable. Rest starts feeling unearned. And eventually, the nervous system begins living in permanent, low-level tension. Always preparing, always anticipating, always mentally working ahead. And maybe your soul has been living there too. Not because you are weak, but because emotional overload changes how people experience peace internally. And perhaps tonight, God is gently revealing something important to your exhausted heart. You were never designed to live emotionally rushed every moment of your life. Even Jesus rested. He walked slowly, paused often, withdrew from crowds, prayed quietly, slept during storms. That image alone feels almost impossible for modern minds to understand fully. Jesus sleeping during a storm, while others panicked, while fear spread everywhere. Jesus rested, not because danger was unreal, but because peace lived deeper than the chaos around him. And perhaps that is the kind of peace your soul has been searching for all along. Not a life without storms, but a soul that no longer collapses inside them. And maybe Martha believed peace would finally come after she controlled everything around her. But peace rooted in control always remains fragile, because life cannot be perfectly controlled. There will always be uncertainty, always unfinished things, always unanswered questions. And perhaps Jesus wanted Martha to discover something Mary already understood quietly. The presence of God is not a reward for finally finishing life perfectly. It is refuge in the middle of unfinished life. That changes everything. Because many exhausted people unknowingly live as though rest belongs only to people who have earned it. But grace does not work that way. Jesus does not invite only fully organized people into peace. He invites tired people, overwhelmed people, distracted people, burdened people, people exactly like Martha, and perhaps people exactly like you, because maybe your exhaustion is not happening because you failed spiritually. Maybe your soul has simply been carrying life without enough moments of sacred stillness, enough breathing, enough quiet, enough presence. And perhaps tonight, God is not asking your soul to solve everything before resting. Perhaps He is asking you to rest before everything is solved, to stop postponing peace, to stop waiting for a future version of life, to finally allow yourself to breathe. Because maybe healing begins the moment the soul realizes, I do not need permission from a perfectly controlled life before I rest in God's presence. And perhaps that realization alone can already make the heart feel a little lighter tonight. One of the biggest misunderstandings about Martha's story is the idea that Jesus was criticizing responsibility itself. But that is not what happens in Luke chapter 10. Jesus never says serving is unimportant. He never says work has no value. He never tells Martha to stop caring. Instead, He exposes something much deeper. Martha's soul had become consumed by internal pressure, and perhaps that distinction matters more than many people realize. Because the issue was not activity alone. The issue was the emotional state underneath the activity. Two people can do the exact same task, while carrying completely different souls internally. One serves peacefully, the other serves anxiously. One moves from presence, the other moves from fear. One works from rest, the other works trying to earn rest. And maybe many people listening tonight have unknowingly spent years living exactly like Martha, not simply doing too much, but carrying life with a constantly pressured soul. Because some people do not know how to exist without internal urgency anymore. If they are not worrying, they feel irresponsible. If they are not mentally preparing, they feel unsafe. If they are not emotionally carrying everyone, they feel guilty. And eventually, the soul forgets how to simply exist peacefully in God's presence. That kind of exhaustion is deeper than physical fatigue. It becomes spiritual noise, a constant internal tension where the heart no longer knows how to become quiet. And perhaps that is why Jesus speaks so tenderly, because He recognizes Martha's soul is not rebellious, it is overwhelmed. That changes everything, because overwhelmed people often assume God is frustrated with them. But Jesus does not respond to Martha with rejection. He responds with invitation. Martha, Martha. There is softness in that moment, not condemnation, not shame, softness. And perhaps some exhausted people need to hear this tonight. God is not disgusted by your exhaustion. He is compassionate toward it. Because maybe your soul has been carrying emotional weight for so long that you no longer remember what inner calm feels like. And perhaps Martha had reached that exact point, still functioning, still serving, still loving Jesus, but internally disconnected from peace. That happens more often than people admit, especially among deeply caring people, people who always help, always show up, always carry responsibility quietly. The world praises those people constantly, but sometimes nobody notices how emotionally exhausted they become internally. And perhaps that is why so many responsible souls secretly feel lonely, because everyone appreciates what they do, while very few notice what they carry emotionally. And eventually, the soul becomes tired of being emotionally on all the time. That phrase alone explains many exhausted hearts. Always on, always available, always responding, always thinking, always managing. And maybe Martha had forgotten that God never created human beings to live permanently emotionally activated. Even creation itself moves in rhythms, day and night, work and rest, breathing in and breathing out. But modern life constantly teaches people to override those rhythms, to keep pushing, keep proving, keep producing, keep carrying. And eventually many souls lose contact with gentleness entirely, not because they stopped loving God, but because they forgot how to live slowly enough to feel His presence deeply. And perhaps that is one reason Jesus says, Mary has chosen what is better. Notice something important. Jesus does not say Mary chose laziness. He says she chose what was better. Why? Because Mary understood something Martha temporarily lost sight of. The presence of Jesus was not interruption. It was priority. And perhaps many exhausted people unknowingly treat peace as interruption too. They postpone prayer, postpone silence, postpone rest, postpone stillness, postpone emotional recovery, always believing they will return to peace later. But later keeps moving further away, and eventually the soul becomes spiritually dehydrated, still functioning externally, but internally exhausted. And perhaps tonight your soul recognizes that feeling. The strange emptiness that can exist even while life continues moving normally. The quiet ache of constantly carrying more emotionally than people realize. The hidden fatigue behind being strong all the time. And perhaps Jesus is speaking the same gentle truth to your heart tonight that He spoke to Martha long ago. You do not need to carry life this way anymore. Not because responsibility disappears, but because your soul was never meant to survive disconnected from rest. That kind of rest is not laziness. It is alignment. Alignment with the pace of grace. Because grace moves differently than anxiety. Anxiety rushes. Grace remains present. Anxiety constantly predicts disaster. Grace breathes. Anxiety believes everything depends entirely on you. Grace remembers God is still God, even when you stop striving for a moment. And perhaps that is what Martha slowly needed to learn. Jesus was not asking her to love less. He was teaching her how to stop carrying love through fear and exhaustion. That is deeply different, because many people serve God while secretly terrified internally. Terrified of failure, terrified of disappointing others, terrified of falling behind, terrified of not being enough, and eventually even good things begin feeling emotionally heavy, but peace cannot grow properly inside a soul constantly driven by fear. And perhaps tonight, God is gently inviting your heart into another way of living, not passive living, not careless living, peaceful living, a slower inner posture, a quieter soul, a nervous system no longer ruled entirely by urgency. And maybe that transformation begins the same place it began for Martha, by sitting down long enough to realize that God's presence was never something you had to earn through exhaustion. It was always a place where tired souls were welcomed first. And perhaps your soul needs that truth tonight more than you realize. Perhaps one of the most beautiful parts of this entire story is not actually Martha, it is Mary. Because Mary reveals something that anxious souls often struggle to believe. Stillness is possible even when life remains unfinished. That sounds simple at first, but for emotionally exhausted people, it feels almost impossible. Because anxious minds constantly whisper, "You should be doing something right now. You're falling behind. You forgot something. You can't relax yet. There's too much to carry." And eventually, The soul becomes unable to separate peace from productivity. Rest begins feeling dangerous. Stillness begins feeling irresponsible. Quietness begins feeling undeserved. But Mary sits anyway. That matters deeply, because Mary was not unaware of the responsibilities around her. She knew there was food to prepare, guests to care for, tasks unfinished. The house still needed attention. Life itself had not paused. Yet somehow, she chose presence over internal panic. And perhaps that is what makes her posture so spiritually powerful. Because Mary trusted that being near Jesus mattered more than emotionally managing everything at once. And perhaps that is exactly what anxious souls struggle to believe today. Not because they lack faith entirely, but because fear quietly taught them that survival depends on constant mental control. So they keep scanning ahead emotionally, trying to predict outcomes, trying to prevent pain, trying to stay prepared, trying to carry tomorrow before tomorrow even arrives. And eventually, the nervous system forgets how to rest inside the present moment. That kind of living becomes exhausting. Not dramatic exhaustion, deep exhaustion, the kind that slowly drains joy from ordinary life, the kind where even peaceful moments feel interrupted internally by mental noise. And perhaps Martha had lived in that emotional state for years, still faithful, still loving, still serving, but internally unable to stop carrying invisible pressure. And perhaps Jesus wanted her to see something through Mary's example. Peace is not created by controlling every outcome. Peace grows through trust. That changes everything, because many people today are trying to create peace through control. Control of schedules, control of outcomes, control of relationships, control of the future, control of emotions. But human beings were never meant to carry that much psychological weight. And eventually, anxious souls begin collapsing under responsibilities God never asked them to carry alone. That is why Jesus says elsewhere in Scripture, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Notice what he offers first. Not answers, not strategies. Rest. Because exhausted souls do not always need more information first. Sometimes they need safety, stillness, presence, breathing room for the heart. And perhaps modern life has quietly stolen that from many people. People wake up already mentally overwhelmed. Their mind instantly fills with unfinished tasks, notifications, responsibilities, stress, pressure, comparison, fear. And before the soul even fully wakes up, anxiety has already entered the room. But Mary shows another way of living, not passive living, trusting living, the kind of trust that allows the soul to stop gripping life so tightly. And perhaps that is what Jesus meant when he constantly told people, "Do not be afraid." Not because life would become easy, but because fear was never meant to become the permanent atmosphere of the human soul. And maybe your heart needs that reminder tonight. Because some people have lived anxious for so long, they no longer realize how deeply fear has shaped their inner world. Fear shapes their decisions, their sleep, their relationships, their thoughts, their body, their breathing, their prayers, even their image of God sometimes. They begin imagining God as constantly disappointed, constantly impatient, constantly demanding more. But Jesus sitting peacefully with Mary reveals another reality entirely. The presence of God is not meant to increase panic. It is meant to calm the soul. That matters deeply, because some people genuinely love God, yet still live emotionally terrified internally, terrified of failure, terrified of disappointing others, terrified of not being enough, terrified of slowing down. And eventually they become like Martha, always moving, always carrying, always mentally working, but internally disconnected from peace. And perhaps tonight, Jesus is not asking your soul to become perfect. Perhaps he is simply asking you to stop carrying tomorrow inside your chest tonight, to release the need to mentally solve everything at once, to breathe, to sit still for one moment without immediately feeling guilty. Because maybe Mary understood something Martha had temporarily forgotten. God's presence is not another responsibility to manage. It is refuge, a safe place for tired souls, a place where anxious hearts slowly soften, a place where the nervous system learns it does not need to remain constantly alert. And perhaps healing begins there, not through force, not through pressure, but through repeated moments of quiet trust. Small moments where the soul finally stops trying to hold the universe together alone. And perhaps tonight, your heart is being invited into that kind of trust again. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because God never intended fear to become the permanent voice inside your soul. And maybe peace begins the moment you realize you do not need to carry every future possibility tonight. You are allowed to sit here too, just like Mary did, quietly, safely, near Jesus, without rushing, without performing, without proving anything, just resting in his presence for a moment. And perhaps your exhausted soul has needed that more than you knew. There is a quiet kind of suffering many people carry every day without realizing how heavy it has become. It is the suffering of living emotionally in the future all the time, not physically, emotionally. The mind constantly running ahead, trying to predict problems before they happen, trying to prepare for pain before it arrives, trying to mentally survive situations that do not even exist yet. And eventually, the soul becomes exhausted by possibilities alone. Perhaps Martha understood that feeling more than she realized, because anxious hearts often live with an invisible belief. If I can stay mentally ahead of everything, maybe I can finally feel safe. But safety built on constant anticipation never truly lasts, because the future always creates new unknowns, new uncertainties, new fears. And eventually, the soul begins carrying emotional weight it was never meant to hold all at once. That is why Jesus speaks so often about tomorrow, not because planning is wrong, but because fear quietly pulls the soul out of the present moment and traps it inside imagined futures constantly. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, "Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself." That verse is often quoted quickly, but rarely felt deeply. Because Jesus was not simply giving advice about stress management, he was revealing something profound about the human soul. Anxious hearts try to carry multiple days emotionally at the same time. Today's burdens, tomorrow's fears, future possibilities, unanswered questions, potential disasters, invisible outcomes, and eventually the nervous system collapses under emotional weight that has not even happened yet. And maybe many people listening tonight know exactly what that feels like. The exhaustion of mentally rehearsing conversations before they happen. The exhaustion of imagining worst-case scenarios repeatedly. The exhaustion of lying awake at night trying to solve future problems in advance. And perhaps Martha's soul had quietly entered that emotional state too, because overloaded people rarely carry only the present moment. They carry imagined futures constantly. What if this goes wrong? What if I fail? What if people are disappointed? What if I can't handle what's coming? And eventually anxiety transforms life into permanent emotional anticipation. But Jesus gently invites people back into something radically different: daily dependence, daily bread, daily grace, daily peace, not future peace, present peace. That changes everything, because many souls postpone calm while waiting for certainty. But certainty was never the foundation of biblical peace. Trust was. Israel walked through the wilderness without knowing the future. David wrote Psalms while surrounded by uncertainty. The disciples followed Jesus without fully understanding where life was leading them. And still, God remained faithful inside incomplete understanding. That matters deeply tonight, because perhaps your soul has been waiting for perfect certainty before allowing itself to rest emotionally. But human life was never designed to provide complete certainty. That is why faith exists, not to remove uncertainty entirely, but to teach the soul how to remain anchored while uncertainty still exists. And perhaps Martha had forgotten that temporarily, because anxious minds often believe, if I can mentally prepare enough, maybe I can prevent pain. But excessive mental control rarely creates peace. It usually creates exhaustion, because the mind never stops searching for new threats once fear becomes its operating system. And perhaps modern culture has quietly normalized this kind of emotional living. People are praised for overthinking, praised for constant hustle, praised for always being available, always preparing, always connected, always mentally active. But few people ask what this pace is doing to the soul internally. And perhaps one reason so many hearts feel emotionally fragile now is because they have lived too long without true inner stillness. The nervous system stays activated constantly. The brain stays overstimulated constantly. The soul stays emotionally vigilant constantly, and eventually people forget what peace even feels like. Not fake positivity, not temporary distraction, real peace, the kind Jesus carried, the kind Mary felt while sitting beside him, the kind Martha could not access because internally she was already living somewhere else emotionally. And perhaps tonight, God is gently inviting your heart back from the future for a moment, back from the imagined scenarios, back from the endless mental rehearsals, back from carrying outcomes you cannot fully control. Because maybe your soul was never meant to survive permanently stretched across tomorrow. Maybe grace was always designed to meet you one day at a time. That is why Scripture constantly returns to the present moment. This is the day the Lord has made. Give us this day our daily bread. My grace is sufficient for you. Not next year, not next month, today. Because peace lives in the present far more than fear does. Fear constantly drags the soul into tomorrow. Peace gently brings it back into now, back into breathing, back into awareness, back into God's presence. And perhaps that is one reason Jesus says, "Look at the birds." What a strange thing to say to anxious people. Look at the birds, look at the lilies, look at creation. Slow down enough to notice that God sustains life without panic. Creation itself trusts Him naturally. Yet human beings often spend years emotionally living in futures they cannot control, and eventually the soul becomes too tired to feel joy properly, too tired to feel wonder, too tired to feel present. And maybe tonight your exhausted heart needs permission to stop carrying tomorrow for a little while. Not because tomorrow is meaningless, but because your soul cannot heal while permanently trapped there emotionally. And perhaps peace begins when the heart finally realizes God is already present in the future you are afraid of. You do not need to arrive there tonight mentally before He does. He is already there, already aware, already faithful, already sustaining what you cannot yet see. And maybe your soul can finally breathe a little more gently knowing that tonight. Most exhausted people think what they need most is relief. Relief from pressure, relief from responsibility, relief from stress, relief from exhaustion. And sometimes, those things truly matter. The human soul was never designed to carry non-stop emotional overload forever. But perhaps what Jesus wanted to give Martha was even deeper than temporary relief. Because relief changes circumstances for a moment. Peace changes the soul underneath the circumstances. That distinction matters deeply, because some people finally get the quiet house they wanted, yet still feel restless internally. Some people finally finish the overwhelming season, yet still cannot relax emotionally. Some people finally escape the pressure, yet their mind keeps running anyway. Why? Because exhausted souls do not only need external calm, they need inner restoration. And perhaps Martha had spent so long trying to organize life externally that she had forgotten her soul itself needed care too. That happens quietly, especially among people who spend their lives caring for everyone else. Eventually, they become experts at noticing everyone's needs except their own. They know when others are tired, when others are hurting, when others need comfort. But internally, they quietly ignore the exhaustion growing inside themselves. And perhaps that is why Jesus speaks with such gentleness to Martha. Because he recognizes something important. Her soul is tired, not sinful, not rejected, tired. That changes the entire emotional atmosphere of this story. Because many believers secretly interpret their exhaustion as spiritual failure. If I trusted God more, I wouldn't feel this way. If I had stronger faith, I wouldn't feel overwhelmed. If I prayed better, I wouldn't be mentally exhausted. But Scripture does not support that idea. Some of the most faithful people in the Bible experienced deep emotional fatigue. Elijah collapsed under exhaustion beneath a tree. David poured anxiety into the Psalms constantly. Jeremiah wept openly before God. Even Jesus himself withdrew often to quiet places because human souls were never meant to live under constant emotional demand without restoration. That matters deeply tonight, because perhaps your exhaustion does not mean you are spiritually weak. Perhaps it means you are human. Human souls require rhythms of restoration, stillness, breathing, presence, silence, reflection, time with God that is not rushed by pressure. And perhaps modern culture has quietly erased many of those rhythms. People are constantly stimulated now, always consuming, always reacting, always available, always mentally engaged, and eventually the soul loses contact with depth entirely. Life becomes surface-level survival. People move quickly, but rarely process deeply. And unprocessed emotional weight slowly accumulates inside the nervous system over time. Grief that was never slowed down enough to heal. Fear that was never brought gently before God. Pressure that was normalized for too long. Silent disappointments. Invisible loneliness. Emotional fatigue hidden behind functioning normally. And eventually the soul becomes thirsty for something deeper than temporary distraction. It becomes thirsty for peace itself, not the world's version of peace, not comfort through avoidance, not numbness, not entertainment. Biblical peace, the kind Jesus carried, the kind that remains steady even when life itself still feels unfinished. That is why Jesus says in John 14, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives." Notice that. My peace, not temporary emotional escape. His peace, a peace rooted deeper than circumstances, a peace that survives uncertainty, a peace that survives unanswered questions, a peace that survives unfinished seasons. And perhaps Martha had never experienced that kind of peace deeply before, because anxious souls often search for peace through control instead of trust. They believe, if I can finally organize life perfectly, then I'll feel calm. but calm built on perfect control collapses easily because life remains unpredictable. And perhaps Jesus wanted Martha to discover something eternal. Peace is not the reward for finally controlling life. Peace is the result of remaining near Him inside uncontrollable life. That changes everything, because perhaps tonight your soul has been searching for peace in places that can only provide temporary relief. Distraction, overworking, avoidance, constant productivity, mental overpreparation, people-pleasing, trying to emotionally manage everyone around you, but none of those things can deeply restore the soul for long. Only presence can, God's presence, the kind that slows the breathing, softens the chest, quiets the nervous system, allows the soul to stop fighting life internally for one moment. And perhaps that is why Mary remained so peaceful near Jesus. Not because her life was perfect, but because her attention rested somewhere deeper than fear. And maybe tonight your exhausted heart is being invited into that same kind of peace. Not fake positivity, not denial, not pretending life is easy. Real peace, the kind that can sit quietly with God even while life remains incomplete. And perhaps that is the miracle many exhausted people actually need most right now. Not immediate solutions to every problem, but a soul no longer drowning beneath them emotionally. And perhaps healing begins exactly there. The moment the heart finally realizes, I do not need to carry every burden internally by myself anymore. Because maybe Jesus was never asking Martha to become less loving. Perhaps He was teaching her how to stop carrying life disconnected from peace. And maybe tonight, He is gently teaching your soul the same thing too. Perhaps the most healing part of Martha's story is that Jesus never rejected her. He corrected her gently, but He never pushed her away. That matters deeply, because many exhausted people secretly fear that their emotional exhaustion disappoints God. They fear that their anxiety means weak faith, that their mental overwhelm means spiritual failure, that their tiredness makes them less good in God's eyes somehow. But the story of Martha reveals the opposite. Jesus saw her exhaustion completely and stayed close anyway. That changes everything. Because perhaps tonight your soul needs to hear something simple but deeply true. God is not waiting for you to become emotionally perfect before He welcomes you into peace. He already knows how tired you are. He already sees the invisible pressure, the racing thoughts, the silent fears, the constant mental carrying, the emotional exhaustion hidden behind functioning normally. And still, He remains gentle. That is one of the quietest miracles in the Gospels. Jesus was surrounded constantly by broken humanity, fearful people, anxious people, grieving people, overwhelmed people, people carrying invisible burdens, and again, His response was compassion, not emotional harshness, not rejection, compassion. And perhaps Martha finally began understanding something many exhausted souls spend years missing. God never asked human beings to survive life disconnected from Him emotionally. That was never the design. The soul was created for communion, for closeness, for stillness in God's presence, for rhythms of grace. But modern life slowly teaches people another way of living, a rushed way, a fragmented way, a permanently overstimulated way. People become emotionally overloaded for so long that eventually peace itself feels unfamiliar. And perhaps that is why this story still reaches hearts so deeply thousands of years later. Because there are still millions of Marthas alive today. People who deeply love God, yet internally feel exhausted. People who constantly carry everyone else emotionally. People who struggle to sit still without guilt. People whose nervous systems remain permanently alert. people who no longer remember what inner quiet feels like. And perhaps tonight your soul recognized itself somewhere inside Martha's story too. Not because you are weak, not because you failed spiritually, but because human hearts were never designed to live under endless emotional pressure without rest. And maybe one reason Jesus speaks so gently to Martha is because he understands the burden of being human completely. Hebrews says Jesus is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. He understands exhaustion, loneliness, pressure, grief, emotional pain. He does not stand distant from human suffering. He enters it. And perhaps that changes the way we should see ourselves too, because many people are kinder to everyone else than they are to themselves. They extend grace outward, while internally living under relentless pressure, constant self-criticism, constant urgency, constant emotional tension. But Jesus did not speak to Martha the way anxious people often speak to themselves. He did not say, "What's wrong with you? Why can't you handle this? You should be doing better." No, he spoke gently, personally, compassionately. "Martha, Martha." And perhaps tonight, God is speaking to your exhausted heart with that same gentleness too, not demanding perfection, not demanding endless striving, simply inviting your soul back into peace, back into breathing, back into stillness, back into trust. Because perhaps true healing begins the moment people stop trying to earn God's love through exhaustion. And maybe that is what Martha slowly began discovering. Jesus never loved her less because she was overwhelmed. He simply wanted her soul to stop living crushed beneath unnecessary emotional weight. And perhaps your soul needs that freedom tonight too. The freedom to stop carrying everything internally all at once. The freedom to stop believing your value depends entirely on productivity. The freedom to sit quietly in God's presence without guilt. The freedom to breathe deeply again. The freedom to trust that God remains faithful even when your mind cannot control the future. And perhaps peace begins there, not when life becomes easy, not when every question receives an answer, not when every burden disappears, but when the soul finally understands, I do not have to carry life alone anymore. That realization changes something deep inside a person. Because maybe rest was never simply about stopping activity. Maybe rest was always about learning how to remain emotionally close to God inside ordinary human life. And perhaps tonight, your tired soul is slowly remembering that again. You do not need to rush healing. You do not need to solve your entire future tonight. You do not need to prove your worth through constant exhaustion. You are allowed to rest gently, quietly, fully, near God, just like Mary did. And perhaps that is what Jesus wanted Martha to discover all along, that peace was never far away. She simply needed to stop carrying so much long enough to receive it. And maybe tonight, your soul can finally receive it too. Stay here. You're not alone.